future trends, deep insights, industry leaders. This is the iGaming Next podcast with your host, Pierre Lindh.
This podcast is brought to you by Pragmatic Solutions, the leading iGaming PAM platform with a modular approach, including many benefits like a fast, secure, and scalable API-based platform, integrated with all major third-party products and services. Make sure you head over to Pragmatic Solutions and join our smart thinking. This podcast is brought to you by the Bombay Experience, defining the future of luxury gaming experiences from digital through to physical, seamlessly, flawlessly, exclusively. Visit Bombay.io.
All right, good afternoon, and welcome Matthew Shaddick, Head of Politics at Smarkets, to the podcast today. Matthew, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks for having me on, Pierre.
It's an absolute pleasure. I guess as a starting point today, you have two very contrasting, painting and relics behind you here, the London Tower Bridge and President Biden. What's the story of the President Biden painting behind you?
Actually, my sister painted that for me. She's an artist. She knocks these things off very quickly. It was a little memento of the 2020 election, which ended up going the right way, I guess, for me.
I like it. And also for the iGaming industry at large, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been an enormous loser for, I guess, almost every major bookmaker had Trump managed to win that election. It was quite a scary night, the night of the election.
That's for sure. And speaking of US politics, today we are going to talk primarily about the midterm elections that are coming up here next week in the United States. The Senate and the House of Representatives is coming up here. And, as a starting point, Matthew, can you talk a little bit about what are the latest odds for the midterm elections? What are the expectations here? I believe that the Republicans are looking pretty strong and pretty favored here to take over both of these houses.
Yeah, I mean, they're very, very strong favourites to regain the House. They only need to pick up a few seats to do that. They've always been strong favourites all the way through the year. Right now, sort of a 10% chance of a surprise Democrat hold. So we're kind of more or less discounting that, and most of the betting is actually going on in the Senate and individual Senate races, where the Democrats were favourites for the latter part of the summer and during September.
Right.
To hold control. At the moment, it's 50-50 in terms of seats between the two parties, but the Republicans took over as favourites a couple of weeks ago, and now they've pulled away a bit, and the latest odds at Smarkets are giving the Republicans about a 69% chance of getting majority. They need at least 51 seats because it's 50-50.
Right, Kamala Harris.
Vice President Harris gets the casting vote. But at the moment, 51-49 is the sort of central projection of the Smarkets prices.
That's really interesting because if you look at Project 538, then the odds are more closer to 50-50 between the Democrats and Republicans to take over, who's going to take over the Senate. What differs in your estimation than to Project 538 and other pollsters?
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting test case of the difference between polling-based models and the betting markets, because really, if you sort of drew a line of the estimates of the, let's say 538, but there's other places like The Economist to do similar things, and the estimates of the betting markets, just to take terms of who's going to control the Senate, then it looks like the polls just lag the betting markets by about 2 weeks. If you just move the line forward a bit, then it always seems to be the poll-based estimates are trying to catch up with what the betting markets are saying. And I guess for a while now, the betting markets have been more convinced that the Republicans will do better than the polls have, and the polls seem to have caught them up. Partly that's down to how a few individual races have gone, and the betting markets have kind of, I think it's just really, the betting market can sometimes see around corners a bit, see things coming up, debates are happening, certain candidates are gaining momentum or not. And in this cycle so far, we don't know the result yet, but you'd have to say the betting market has looked like a better guide for where the probabilities are going.
Right, interesting. So essentially, what you see today is what the pollsters see tomorrow. In other words.
Well, we obviously don't know what the result is, but if the Republicans end up winning the Senate and doing better than expected, maybe picking up even more seats than 51, then I think a lot of people who have been promoting the usefulness of betting markets as opposed to polls will be feeling like they've been vindicated.
Right. So the interesting, obviously, comparisons here to 2020, the general election, and 2016, the general election, was that I suppose both the better markets and the pollsters were heavily favoring the Democrats to take the presidency. And both of those elections turned out to be much closer, of course, than either of the two prediction models could have known before the election. Is there a bias kind of against the Democrats here that is not visible in the polls, or do you constantly adjust these models in order to predict better who is going to win the election this time around?
Well, I think gamblers are thinking about what you've just mentioned, the fact that in the last two presidential elections and indeed the Senate races that were run in 2020, Republicans seem to uniformly do better than the polls expected. And I think people are really expecting that's going to happen again. People aren't convinced that the pollsters have really worked out why that was. Having said that, though, if you go back, a few more cycles in the US elections, there have been occasions where the Democrats have outperformed the polls. It hasn't been like a consistent bias in favour of the Republicans all the way through, although perhaps there's something to do with the current breed of Republican voters. I think one of the theories is that a lot of these people just simply don't like answering polls. And,
right.
The people who don't answer polls are more Republican than expected, then you'll get a Democratic bias in the polls, and people are expecting that. So I think that is driving quite a lot of the sort of betting market sentiment anyway.
Right. Fair enough. And do you expect we'll see any surprises in the midterm? So looking at the polls at the moment, is there any major surprises that you can foresee, Matthew? I mean,
right now, there are a few people betting on some very unlikely looking Republican wins. If there's going to be any surprises, it feels like they're going to be Republicans that were big prices popping up and winning somewhere. One that springs to mind is the governor's race in New York, where the Democrats currently have the incumbent there, but you can back the Republicans at 4-1 to win that. A couple of polls have put it quite close. Normally, the Democrats would win that quite easily, but if you're looking for a surprise there, from my point of view, just betting on this personally, I think the best chance of a surprise is sort of the other way. It's that if the betting markets continue to be very pro-Republican compared to the polls, let's say, right, and this gets even more extreme, because in a lot of the really important Senate races that look close, Pennsylvania, Arizona, so on, the Republicans have taken those favourites now, and if by election day they become even stronger favourites, then my kind of urge is sort of to say, well, this has probably gone a bit too far. I can understand why people think the Republicans will overperform, but maybe now it's time to back the Democrats. So especially someone like Pennsylvania, which has been a fascinating race, I'm on the verge of backing the Democrats. Haven't done that yet.
Interesting, but overall, you get the feeling that if there is a landslide towards one side or the other, it's the feeling that you're getting is that it's more likely that the Republicans will kind of outperform overall than say the Democrats.
Yeah, yes, I guess so. If you think back to, not just talking about the US, if you think about elections worldwide, and mostly the polls are pretty good. But when you get surprises, at least in the recent decades, well, let's say the last 10 years, it does quite often seem to be the right that always does a bit better. You're waking up the next morning finding that they've had a surprise victory, and you don't get too many occasions where you find that Social Democrats or left-wing parties have surprisingly won an election. Perhaps that's just a coincidence, but it doesn't seem to have happened too often recently.
No, it's true. Being a Swedish person myself, you know that we had a Swedish election recently. The kind of far-right party, in a sense, became the second biggest party in Sweden, for example.
Although the polls were actually quite close in Sweden, weren't they? They weren't far off. It just, the right slightly overperformed and just managed to win by a seat or two, didn't they?
Yeah. True story. I want to also jump ahead a little bit of time here to the general elections of 2024 in the US. I'm quite curious, and it's something some of me and my friends we are looking at to try to understand what is actually going to happen here. So on the Republican side, there seems to be a storm brewing between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump. They seem to be the two kind of prime candidates here. Like, what are your expectations here in the Republican candidacy? Who do you favor between the two, or maybe there's a third candidate?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, this, because I think it mostly depends on just whether Donald Trump gets the starting line up or not. Because if he does, it's not at all clear that someone like DeSantis or anyone else important is going to stand against him, because he's still quite popular among Republican voters. So a lot of this is going to depend on Trump's legal issues, possibly health issues. He's quite old. Let's see how he's feeling in a couple of years' time. But if you think that something is going to stop Trump winning, then all of a sudden it becomes very interesting. Now, DeSantis does look like the most likely winner. He's actually got a re-election bid for Florida governor coming up next Tuesday as well. I mean, he's a big favourite to win, but you never know. If that doesn't go very well for him, then all of a sudden things will change. I have backed a couple of big outsiders on the Republican side, just in case Trump doesn't run, because then the field will become very open. I guess the one I like the most is Tim Scott, who's the Republicans' only black senator. I think he's still about 50-1 to get the nomination. That's not the worst bit I've ever seen.
Fair enough. Ron DeSantis, however, he seems to be gathering some quite heavy support. Elon Musk came out recently to support Ron DeSantis specifically. It feels in general like the kind of the big tech community is more leaning more and more towards the right as well. And maybe that's I kind of underestimated the support that even if Trump will be able to run in 2024, that Ron DeSantis will still be able to pull through.
Yeah, DeSantis was actually 100-1 shot when after the last election, when the 2020 election had concluded and people first put out prices, you could have backed him at 100-1. Currently, he's trading at just under 4-1, I guess. So some people are sitting on some nice bets there.
What is Trump at the moment?
Yeah, well, it's almost level. Trump and DeSantis are both trading around 4.6, 4.7 to win the presidency. With Biden's price has actually got his chance of improved a bit according to the odds in recent months.
Okay,
he's third favourite, and again on the Democratic side, it's just quite the most important thing to try and work out is how likely it is that Biden's actually going to run again. Because if he does, as sitting president, you'd think he'd very likely be the nominee despite his age. But if he doesn't run, then and given that Kamala Harris is not very popular, that would be a completely wide open race. So I don't really have a view on who might win otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. If it's not Joe Biden, if it's not Kamala Harris, do you think there is any Democrat that can kind of rise right through the ashes here in the next 2 years?
Yeah, there's people.
Be a strong option.
Yeah. The next favourite in the actual betting right now, Gavin Newsom, who's governor of California.
Right.
Some pros and cons there. And Pete Buttigieg, who ran a very good campaign in 2020.
Right.
Is now in Biden's cabinet, very young and kind of charismatic. So,
yes. And Maltese for that matter. Yes. With Maltese roots as well, maybe good for the gambling industry. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
He's the gambling industry's choice of president for sure. Yeah, interesting nonetheless. But if you would summarize like your current thoughts of the election 2024, if you were to put money on an outcome today, what would be your bet?
Well, as I say, I am leaning towards backing the Democrats, just because I think the prices have just got a bit too skewed in favour of the Republicans. And I'm tempted just to wait a few more days until we get to the day of the election or the day before and just see how things are looking, because it could become, you can actually get some very big swings in elections, even elections that have been, they've been in markets open for months, maybe years. You can get a big change on the day of the election. And quite frequently, the actual moves on election day are wrong. So I'm probably going to be waiting till Tuesday and see how things lie then.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what are the current odds now between the Democrats and the Republicans taking the presidency of 2024?
Well, it's slight favourites. The Republicans will end up taking the White House, whoever that is. but it's pretty close.
Okay. Fair enough. I want to just jump over a bit as well to Brazil, where there was the general election just the other week, where the very controversial former president Bolsonaro was defeated by a very interesting candidate, Lula, who was a former president in Brazil in the 2000s. I'm not super well informed, but it's a very interesting story in Brazil, of course, which obviously has been surrounded by controversy in the last couple of years. Can you talk about the election in Brazil? Who is Lula, the new president in Brazil? What does this mean to the country? So on and so forth.
Yeah, Lula's not quite president yet. He's got to be inaugurated in a few weeks' time, I think. But
right.
It seems like Bolsonaro is going to allow that to happen. It was an insane betting market, crazy. There were, tens of millions of pounds bet on this across the world, not least in Brazil. And the most amazing thing about it was on the day of they had a first round at the start of October, which narrowed it down to the two candidates who everyone knew would be in the second round. Then they had a runoff Sunday just gone, which Lula won by 2 points. But incredibly, on the day of the election, had you been able to bet on some Brazilian betting platforms, you could have backed Lula at 4-1. And at exactly the same time, on European and US betting platforms, you could have backed Bolsonaro at 9-4. So you're betting sort of 50% book or something. I mean, unfortunately, I couldn't find a way of getting on with any of these Brazilian bookmakers. But for a multi-million pound betting market, tens of millions of pounds bet, reals, dollars, to have that level of inefficiency is, I cannot think of another example in any sport or anything recently. I mean, it used to be the case in soccer sometimes that, different countries would have different prices depending on who was playing. That doesn't really happen anymore. I guess in Eurovision you sometimes see these kind of national biases, but in a big election like this, it was crazy.
Right, but the same thing happened kind of in the general elections of 2020, right? Where I remember when we talked about the general elections last time, not exactly that the odds were shifting between country to country, but the fact that the pollsters were favoring the Democrats so heavily, but so many people were betting on the Republicans that the odds were very much skewed against the Republicans' favor, so to say.
Yeah. It seems that people actually betting in Brazil, and there are some, for instance, Entain, where I used to work, do have a Brazilian facing platform. And from what I hear, it was just completely disproportionately Brazilian people were backing Bolsonaro. Now, why it is, I don't know. But I mean, some of the reasons that you could think about here is that Bolsonaro and candidates like Bolsonaro, I guess you could say Trump as well, they tend to have a much bigger share of the male vote than the female vote. And of course, the betting world is much more male dominated. And so perhaps that sometimes skews things when you have candidates like this.
Yeah, fair enough. And what will this mean to the country of Brazil? Can you explain just the candidates and the agendas of these two candidates? What differs between them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about this, but I mean, they're very polarizing candidates. Bolsonaro, essentially a populist right-wing candidate, extremely similar to Trump in a lot of ways. And Lula, as you say, was president in 10 or 15 years ago. He's really he's a really socialist candidate, essentially. Left-wing, was in prison for a couple of years for corruption charges, which later got overthrown. So it was a very polarizing election. I mean, it was interesting. Again, here, Bolsonaro did much better than the polls suggested. The polls suggested he would be 10 points behind in the first round, and he was 5 points behind. And it was only a 2-point win for Lula in the final round. So put that down as another example of the right overperforming the polls. Right.
Interesting. And the final question as well today, Matthew, as you look forward now in the next coming months and kind of year, are there any other elections to keep an eye on at the moment?
Actually, do you know what? It's actually a relatively quiet period for elections after the midterms, because we had a lot of major European elections in the last 12 months or so: Germany, France, Italy, Sweden. Sweden, Denmark. And we don't have too many scheduled for next year. Now, there's a chance that the UK will have a general election next year, sort of about a 20%, 25% chance, because the government could call one early. Doesn't seem all that likely at the moment. And of course, we'll have the start of the build up to the 2024 elections in the the US, when we'll find out, whether Trump will run, perhaps, and some other candidates will start declaring and starting to raise money and raise their profile. There's an election in Argentina. I haven't spent too much time looking at that, but the Argentinians are having a presidential election. And of course, it never stops. There'll always be some big news event or something crazy will happen somewhere to engage everybody in political betting again.
The wonderful world of politics, Matthew Shaddick. And for me, it's interesting. I mean, coming from the iGaming industry for a long time, obviously it's on the one side of the table, the pollsters are saying one thing. But for me, what is interesting to hear when we try to predict what's going to happen in politics is the betting industry, who puts the money where the mouth is. So you would expect that there's a lot more research and knowledge behind kind of the odds.
Yeah, absolutely. One last thing we just mention, Pierre, is a very interesting situation in America right now, where the only places where you can legally place regulated political bets is a site called Predict It, which is about to be shut down by the feds.
Yeah.
And one other platform, Kalshi, which is trying to get permission to host political betting markets, it doesn't look like that decision is going to go their way either. So maybe very shortly, it may be that people in America won't be able to bet on politics at all, at least in any kind of regulated way.
Yeah, maybe we can just linger on this a little bit. So in Europe, we are accustomed to political betting. This is not anything that is controversial over here. But in America, this is essentially outlawed. The operators are not allowed to offer odds and betting on politics. Why is that? Or has it always been like this? Or?
Yeah, I mean, so since perhaps that act was repealed, I guess, and sportsbooks are allowed, online sportsbooks are allowed in the US. So, a large number of US states now you can bet on sports, at least online. But none of those states have licensed political betting. I mean, the way the way it works over there is operators get a list of things they're allowed to bet on, which tends to be major sporting leagues, and none of those lists have ever included politics. And the only way you could bet on politics was via these platforms which had a special license from the futures CFTC, which is more in the sort of financial world, just treating it like a financial hedging product. And it seems like they're going to discontinue that. So, I mean, the main objection you hear is about how political betting might compromise the democratic process. But as you say, this has been going on for decades, 60 years in the UK, and literally no evidence of anything like that. So, I think the strongest case is just to say, well, look at the European experience. Really hasn't been any significant issues of the ones that are mentioned when people oppose it. So I'm still a bit confused about why the Americans haven't got their house in order here.
We'll hope that our American friends come to their senses sooner or later, essentially. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to monitor the elections here that's taking place on Tuesday. Let's see what the outcome is, and let's see who is right between the pollsters, the odds makers, or maybe the bettors themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pierre.